In the days after Blaise Pascal died, in August of 1662, a servant, going through his clothes, felt something stiff beneath the lining of a coat. The stitches were opened. Inside was a folded parchment, written over in a careful hand, and folded within it, an older sheet of paper carrying the same words in hurried writing. The seams showed signs of having been opened and sewn again, and the family concluded that Pascal had likely moved the document from garment to garment, keeping it close to his body. For years, he had told no one. The dead man was 39 years old. He had built one of the first calculating machines in history. He had weighed the air itself. He had helped invent the mathematics of chance that still runs quietly beneath the insurance policies and the forecasts you trust today. And yet the secret he carried was none of those things. Tonight, we are going to unfold that parchment, but to understand what is written on it, we have to begin much earlier, in a quiet town in the mountains of France, where a little boy was forbidden to learn mathematics. The town of Clermont sat in the old province of Auvergne, in the very centre of France, in a landscape unlike anywhere else in the country. The hills around it were not ordinary hills. They were the worn cones of ancient volcanoes, long asleep, rising green and strange against the sky. The town itself was built from their stone, a dark volcanic rock, so that whole streets and even the great cathedral carried a colour closer to charcoal than to grey. Travellers who passed through often remarked on it, a city of black stone, in the shadow of sleeping fire. It was here, on June 19th, 1623, that Blaise Pascal was born. His father was Etienne Pascal, a judge in the local tax court, a man of law and position. In the France of that time, such offices were not simply jobs. They were property, purchased and owned, and they placed a family securely in the class of educated professionals, comfortable but not noble, respected but always working. Etienne was, by the standards of any century, an unusual man. He was trained in law, but his private passion was mathematics, and he was good enough at it that a curve he studied is still called Pascal's limaçon in textbooks today. Named not for his famous son, but for him. Hold on to that detail, because it changes the meaning of everything that follows. The man who would one day forbid his son to study mathematics was not a man who feared it or failed to understand it. He was a man who loved it. And that makes his decision one of the strangest and most interesting choices in the history of education. Blaise was the second of 3 surviving children, and the 2 sisters on either side of him will matter in this story almost as much as he does. So meet them properly now. The elder was Gilberte, 3 years his senior. If the Pascal household were a ship, Gilberte was the keel, steady, watchful, the child who noticed when a candle had burned too low, or when a brother had gone a whole afternoon without eating. Later in life, she kept her own household accounts down to the sou, and there is no reason to think the habit began in adulthood. She would grow into the family's caretaker and, in time, its memory. Because it is largely through the account of her brother's life that she wrote after his death that we can tell this story at all. When you hear, tonight, what Blaise looked like in a fever, or what he said in grief, you are almost always hearing it through Gilberte's eyes. Remember that, both for what it gives us and for what it means. She was a loving witness, and loving witnesses polish what they remember. The younger sister was Jacqueline, born 2 years after Blaise. She was the household's spark, a child who composed verses as naturally as other children played, charming visitors out of their composure before she had learned to write in a straight line. Quick, stubborn, warm, she was the sibling most like Blaise himself, and their 2 lives would twist around each other, pulling and yielding by turns, all the way to the end. Then, in 1626, when Blaise was 3 years old, their mother died. Her name was Antoinette Begon. The historical record holds very little of her. A name, a family, a handful of dates, and Gilberte's brief description of a pious and gentle woman. Beyond that, the mother of Blaise Pascal is nearly silent in history, and it is better to admit that silence than to invent a portrait to fill it. But the silence itself tells us something. From the age of 3, Blaise Pascal grew up in a house without a mother. There would be no second marriage. Etienne, still a young man, chose not to remarry, which was uncommon for a widower of his standing in that era. Instead, he made a decision that would quietly redirect the entire story you are hearing tonight. He decided to raise and educate his children himself, personally, completely. Consider how unusual that was. A man of Etienne's position was expected to send his son away to a school run by religious orders, where boys learned Latin through repetition and discipline, sitting in rows, memorizing what they were told to memorize. That was the machine that produced educated Frenchmen. Etienne looked at that machine and walked away from it. In 1631, when Blaise was 8, Etienne sold his position in Clermont, gathered his 3 motherless children, and moved the household to Paris. He had one project now, and the project was them. His method, as Gilberte describes it, was built on a single principle that sounds astonishingly modern. A child should never be given a subject until the child is ready to truly grasp it. And whenever possible, the child should discover the answer rather than receive it. Lessons in the Pascal house were conversations. Etienne would raise a question at the table. Why does gunpowder explode? Why does a glass ring when you strike it? And the children were invited to reason their way toward the answer. Out loud, together. Language came first. Grammar, Latin, Greek, the structure of thought itself, and mathematics, the subject Etienne loved most, was deliberately placed last. He believed geometry was so beautiful, so satisfying to the mind, that a child who tasted it too early would refuse to eat anything else. So he set a rule: no mathematics until the boy was around 15. He went further than the rule. According to the family's account, he locked away his own books on the subject, and when his learned friends visited, mathematics was not to be discussed in front of the children. Think about what that does to a curious child. It is the oldest pattern in human nature, and every parent listening tonight already knows it. There is no advertisement in the world more powerful than a locked door. Etienne had not removed mathematics from his son's life. He had transformed it into a mystery, glowing quietly at the edge of every dinner conversation. The one thing in a house full of questions that was never allowed to be asked. There was one more shadow over those early years. Blaise was a frail child, from around the age of 1. According to accounts preserved in the family, he suffered strange, wasting episodes that frightened the household. A story recorded much later by his niece claims the family came to believe a local woman had cast a spell on the child. That tale was written down long after the events, by someone born years after them, in an age that reached for supernatural explanations as naturally as we reach for medical ones, and historians give it little weight. What no one doubts is the simpler fact underneath. Blaise Pascal was fragile from the beginning. His body would be his lifelong enemy. The mind we are about to watch ignite was housed, from the very start, in a frame that could barely support it. This is the household that settled into Paris in 1631. A widowed father with a brilliant, hidden passion, Gilberte, about 11 years old, already keeping small order in a motherless house. Jacqueline, 6, making rhymes in the corner and watching everyone's face to see whether the rhyme had landed. And, in the middle, a thin, serious 8-year-old boy, asking questions at the table, absorbing everything, and slowly becoming aware that somewhere in his father's locked cabinet there is a subject so wonderful that he is not allowed even to hear its name. Etienne believed he had built a wall around geometry. What he had actually built, without knowing it, was a door, and one quiet afternoon, while his father was away, the boy was going to walk through it, armed with nothing but a piece of charcoal and a question he could not put down. The story of what happened next comes to us from Gilberte, who was living in the house when it happened, and even she, writing years later, seems slightly amazed by what she is reporting. One afternoon in Paris, when Blaise was around 12 years old, Etienne walked into the room where his son was supposed to be at play, and stopped. The boy was on the floor. He had a piece of charcoal in his hand, and the floor tiles around him were covered in drawings. Lines, triangles, circles. He did not know the proper names for any of them. According to Gilberte's account, he called a circle a round, and a line a bar, because he had never been taught the words. He had invented his own. Etienne asked him what he was doing. The boy explained. He had been wondering about triangles, about what their angles added up to, and he had been working it out, step by step, drawing by drawing, and as Etienne listened, following the charcoal marks across the floor, he realized with a shock that his son, who had never been shown a page of geometry in his life, had reasoned his way to a truth that stands as the 32nd proposition in the first book of Euclid. The angles of a triangle, taken together, always equal 2 right angles. Now, pause, because this famous scene deserves careful handling. It comes to us from a memoir written by a grieving sister about a brother she loved, and family memoirs tend to polish their subjects. Some historians suspect the details grew in the telling. Perhaps the boy had overheard more at the dinner table than anyone realized. Perhaps the discovery was less complete than Gilberte remembered. We cannot stand in that room and check. What can be said is this. The people closest to Blaise Pascal believed the story completely, and what the boy went on to do within a very few years explains why they found it so easy to believe. What Etienne did in that moment tells us as much about the father as about the son. Gilberte says he did not speak. He left the room, went to the house of his closest friend, and when the friend saw his face, He asked whether some disaster had struck the family. Etienne is said to have answered that he was not weeping from sorrow, but from joy. Then he went home, unlocked the cabinet, and placed a copy of Euclid in his son's hands. The wall came down, and the boy went through the opening like water through a broken dam. Within 2 years, Etienne was doing something almost unheard of. He was bringing his teenage son to the weekly meetings of the most serious scientific circle in Paris, a gathering hosted by a friar named Marin Mersenne. To understand what that room meant, you have to understand that in the 1630s there were no scientific journals, no research universities in the modern sense, no way for discoveries to travel except by letter and by conversation. Mersenne was the living centre of that network. He wrote to Galileo in Italy. He wrote to Descartes in the Netherlands. A result announced in Mersenne's room on a Saturday could be known across Europe within a season. It was, in the language of our own century, the inbox of European science, and a boy of 14 was now sitting in it, listening, and then, gradually, speaking. At 16, he stopped listening and made his move. In 1640, a short printed essay on the geometry of conic sections appeared in Paris, barely a few pages long, and those pages contained a theorem so elegant that mathematicians still teach it today. Take any 6 points on a circle or an ellipse, connect them into a hexagon, and something hidden and beautiful happens with the crossing points of its sides. They line up, always. The young author called the figure the mystic hexagram, and the result is known to this day as Pascal's theorem. The essay travelled, as everything did, through Mersenne's letters, and it reached René Descartes, then the most formidable philosopher and mathematician in Europe. His reaction survives in the correspondence of the period, and it was not generous. He remarked that he was not surprised the work seemed clever, because he could not believe a 16-year-old had actually produced it. The suspicion, in other words, was that the father had written it and signed the son's name. It is one of history's quiet ironies. The first great compliment Blaise Pascal ever received from a genius was an accusation, and the accusation proves the point better than praise could. The work was so good that the sharpest skeptic alive found a teenager an easier thing to doubt than the mathematics. While the sun was rising, the father was falling into danger, and the danger came from the government itself. Etienne had invested his fortune in state bonds, and in 1638 the crown, strained by war, slashed the payments. Etienne joined a protest of angry investors, and protesting the finances of Cardinal Richelieu's France was not a safe hobby. Word came that he was at risk of arrest. He fled Paris and went into hiding, leaving his children behind. The family's rescue arrived from the most unexpected direction imaginable. Richelieu, the Iron Minister of France, had a fondness for theatre, and in the winter of 1639 a troupe of children was arranged to perform for him. One of them was Jacqueline Pascal, now 13, already known for her verses. According to the family's account, when the performance ended, the girl approached the most feared man in the kingdom and recited lines asking pardon for her father. Richelieu granted it. More than that, within months, Etienne was given a royal appointment, a serious and demanding one. He was made the king's commissioner for taxes in Upper Normandy, based in the city of Rouen. The family that had fled the government now worked for it. And so, in the opening days of 1640, the Pascals packed their household once again and travelled north, into a province simmering with unrest, toward a mountain of arithmetic that was about to bury the father alive. The son watched it happen, and being who he was, he did not merely sympathize. He started designing. Rouen in 1640 was not a gentle posting. Normandy had just been torn by a tax revolt, an uprising of the poor that had been put down with soldiers and executions. Etienne Pascal arrived as the man responsible for reassessing and collecting the very taxes that had lit the fire. It was dangerous, thankless, and, above all, endless work. The assessments of an entire province had to be calculated, checked, and recalculated, and every one of those calculations had to be done the only way calculations had ever been done in all of human history, by hand. In the house at Rouen, the candles burned late into the night. Etienne and his assistants bent over ledgers, adding column after column in the old French money, which was almost deliberately cruel to arithmetic. 12 deniers to a sou, 20 sous to a livre, so that nothing could be added the easy way. The same figures checked twice, 3 times, because a single slipped digit meant a family taxed wrongly or a sum missing before the crown. Blaise, now 17, often worked beside his father, and he watched one of the finest mathematical minds in France being consumed. Hour after hour, by labour a child could perform, not thinking, just grinding. Most people who watch someone they love suffer through tedious work offer sympathy, or their own evenings. Blaise Pascal reached a different conclusion, and it is a conclusion that had waited thousands of years for someone to take seriously. He decided that adding numbers did not actually require a mind at all. It required only rules, and rules could be built out of brass if the reasoning could be put into gears. The gears could do the reasoning. It took him roughly 2 years of obsessive labour, beginning around 1642, and the obsession nearly broke him. The problem was not the idea. The idea was clean. A wheel for each column of digits. Units, tens, hundreds, and a mechanism so that when one wheel turned past 9, it would nudge its neighbour forward by exactly 1. The carry, the little moment in addition that every schoolchild learns, carried the 1, translated into metal. That mechanism, so simple to say, was brutally hard to build, because it had to work even when a whole row of 9s rolled over at once, a cascade of motion passing through the machine like a wave. And the deeper problem was the century itself. Pascal was designing a precision device in a world without precision manufacturing. Every gear, every axle, every spring had to be made by hand, by craftsmen trained for clocks and locks, and according to accounts from the period he wore through dozens of models, redesigning, rejecting, starting again. He complained of the gap between what he could conceive and what any hand in France could cut. It is a complaint every engineer since has known. He was not just inventing a machine, he was inventing the standards it required. But by 1645, it existed. A polished brass box, small enough to carry, with dials on its face, like a row of little clocks. You entered a number by turning the dials with a stylus, entered another, and the answer simply appeared in small windows along the top. No effort, no error, no mind. The machine came to be called the Pascaline, and its inventor was 22 years old. He dedicated it to the Chancellor of France, and in 1649 he secured from the Crown a royal privilege granting him exclusive right to manufacture the device, an ancestor of the modern patent. That document matters, because it makes the Pascaline not merely a laboratory wonder, but a commercial product. Among the first calculating machines in history offered for sale to the public, perhaps 20 were built over the following years, and several survive today, in museums in Paris and Dresden, still capable of adding, their gears still obedient after nearly 4 centuries. The other half of the story is less glorious. As a business, the Pascaline failed. Each machine was handmade and ferociously expensive, costing more than a professional's yearly wage. So the only customers were nobles and collectors who displayed it in cabinets as a marvel, a conversation piece beside the seashells and the ancient coins. The clerks and taxmen who actually needed it could never afford it, and historians now know that a German professor named Wilhelm Schickard had sketched and partly built a calculating device 2 decades earlier. Though it burned unfinished and vanished from knowledge for centuries, Pascal knew nothing of it. In the world, as anyone could know it, the age of the calculating machine began in a house in Rouen. And here is the thought worth carrying with you tonight. Historians of computing draw a serious line of descent from mechanical calculators like the Pascaline, through the calculating engines of the 19th century, toward the machines of our own age. 3 centuries after Rouen, when the computer scientist Niklaus Wirth created a programming language to teach the world how to instruct machines clearly, he named it Pascal. And through the 1980s, that language trained a generation of programmers. The name was not decoration. It was a debt acknowledged. The son had built the machine to save his father. That is worth repeating, because we remember Pascal as a genius of abstractions, and his first great work was an act of love with a practical shape. But somewhere in those 2 years of gears and frustration, something larger had crept into his thinking. He had built an instrument, and the instrument had extended what a human being could do. His hands now knew that knowledge could be built, not just written. That readiness was about to meet its moment, because news was arriving from Italy. Word of a strange experiment. A glass tube, a pool of silver liquid, and a question that sounded almost childish and was about to crack the ancient world open. What, exactly, is inside an empty space? The question arrived from Italy, and it began, of all places, at the bottom of a well. For years, the engineers of Tuscany had known an odd and stubborn fact. A suction pump, the kind used to draw water out of mines and wells, could lift water about 34 feet, and not 1 inch more. No matter how well the pump was built, no matter how hard the men worked, the handle, the water climbed to that height and simply stopped, as if it had reached an invisible ceiling. When the problem was mentioned to the aging Galileo, he admitted it puzzled him. The old doctrine said that nature abhors a vacuum, that empty space is impossible, and the world rushes to fill it. But if nature truly abhorred a vacuum, Why did her abhorrence give up at 34 feet? After Galileo's death, his student Evangelista Torricelli picked up the question, and around 1643, in work he described in letters the following year, he performed one of the most consequential small experiments in human history. Instead of water, he used mercury, a liquid roughly 14 times heavier, reasoning that whatever held water at 34 feet should hold mercury at about 1/14 of that height. He filled a glass tube with mercury, sealed one end, turned it upside down into a bowl of the same silver liquid, and watched. The mercury slid down the tube and stopped at about 28 inches. Above it, at the top of the sealed tube, was a small space that had contained mercury a moment before and now contained, apparently, nothing at all. Torricelli proposed an explanation of breathtaking simplicity. The mercury was not being held up by nature's hatred of emptiness. It was being pushed up by the weight of the air pressing down on the bowl. In a letter describing the work, he reached for an image that scientists have repeated ever since. The picture of human beings living at the bottom of a vast sea of air, with the whole visible world submerged beneath its surface. The column of mercury was simply a scale, and what it was weighing was the sky. News of the experiment travelled through Messene's letters and reached Rouen, where it found the one household in France perhaps best prepared to receive it. A father and son who believed in trying things, a city famous for its glassworks, and a young man whose hands had just spent 2 years learning what instruments could do. Pascal did not merely repeat the Italian experiment. He staged it at a scale no one had attempted. Working with the glassmakers of Rouen, he had tubes made as long as 46 feet, and because tubes of that size could not be handled in a study, the trials spilled into the open air. Imagine the scene at the port of Rouen on a winter day in 1646 or 47. A crowd gathering along the quay, breath steaming, dock workers pausing with their loads, a slender glass tube, taller than a house, lashed upright to a ship's mast, men hauling on ropes to tilt it, water climbing inside the glass, and a hush spreading as the column rises, and then stops, refusing the last few feet. Obeying a law nobody watching can see. He ran the trials with water and with wine, and this was not showmanship for its own sake. His opponents claimed the space at the top of the tube was filled with invisible vapours escaping the liquid. Wine, being more spirited, should produce more vapour and therefore a shorter column. The vacuum theory predicted the opposite. The vacuum theory won. In 1647 he published his results in a short book on new experiments concerning the void, written not in scholarly Latin but in plain French, so that any educated reader could follow the reasoning. The old world did not surrender quietly. A respected Jesuit professor named Father Noel wrote to him, insisting that truly empty space was impossible, and the exchange of letters that followed contains a sentence of Pascal's that deserves to outlive almost everything else in the dispute. In matters of physical science, he argued, we should assert only what we can verify, and authority, however ancient, is not evidence. It was a polite letter. It was also a door closing on 2,000 years of arguing from books. That same autumn, 1647, Pascal received a famous visitor in Paris, René Descartes himself. The man who had once doubted a teenager's theorem came to see him twice over 2 days, and the accounts that survive suggest the conversations were tense. Descartes did not believe a vacuum could exist, and yet, according to the historical record, the two men discussed a further experiment, and Descartes would later claim in a letter that the idea had been his. While Pascal's camp maintained it was already in motion, historians have never fully untangled the priority, and we will not pretend to untangle it tonight. What matters is the idea itself. Because it was beautiful, if the mercury is held up by the weight of the air, then the answer is hiding on a mountain. Climb high enough, and there is less ocean of air above you. The mercury should drop. If instead nature abhors a vacuum, the mountain changes nothing, because nature presumably abhors it at every altitude equally. Pascal was far too ill to climb anything, but Gilberte had married a capable man named Blaise Périer, and Périer lived in Clermont. At the foot of the tallest of those sleeping volcanoes of Pascal's childhood, the Puy de Dôme, Pascal wrote to him with instructions, and on September 19th, 1648, Périer and a small party of local worthies, clergymen and officials whose names he carefully recorded as witnesses, carried out what stands as one of the clearest early examples of a controlled experiment in modern European science. They set up 2 identical mercury tubes in the town below. Both read the same. One was left behind, watched all day by a monk, to prove the reading did not drift on its own. The other was carried up the mountain. Nearly 1,000 meters of climbing. At the summit, the mercury stood more than 3 inches lower than in the town. They measured again and again at different spots on the peak, and on the way down they measured at an intermediate height and found an intermediate reading. The air had weight. The weight grew less as you climbed. The sky had been measured with a ruler. When the results reached Pascal, he arranged a smaller encore in Paris, comparing readings at the bottom and top of the Tower of Saint Jacques, a difference of mere dozens of feet, and even there the mercury obeyed. He published the account promptly, and in the years that followed he developed the deeper mathematics in treatises on the balance of liquids and the weight of the air. That work laid down what students still learn as Pascal's principle. The rule that pressure applied to a confined fluid is transmitted equally in every direction. It is the principle behind the hydraulic press and the hydraulic brake, which is to say, it has been quietly at work every time you have ridden in a car. And when the modern world chose a standard scientific unit for pressure itself, it reached back across 3 centuries and chose his name. The Pascal is now the international unit of pressure used across science and engineering. And weather services in much of the world report the atmosphere in hectopascals. The young man who sent his brother-in-law up a volcano is, in a quiet way, in the forecast. There is a quieter discovery underneath all this machinery, and it matters more than the tubes and the mountain. A question about the world was settled not by a famous name, not by a holy text, not by the elegance of an argument, but by a measurement, witnessed, repeated, and published. Pascal understood exactly what that meant, and he said so in his exchanges with the traditionalists. The ancients deserve reverence, he argued. But in matters of fact, experience is the master, and truth is always older than every opinion about it. He was 25 years old, and he stood at the edge of a long, brilliant scientific career. And here the story turns. Because the body that housed this mind was failing, and into the house of the Pascals there had already walked, quietly, 2 years earlier, an idea more demanding than the vacuum. It came in through an accident on the ice, and it would claim, one by one, nearly everyone he loved. It began with a fall, in January of 1646. On the frozen ground of Rouen, Etienne Pascal slipped on the ice and injured his hip so badly that for a time his life was feared for. 2 gentlemen of the region, brothers named Deschamps, were known as skilled bone setters, and they were called to the house. They stayed for months, tending the father, and they brought with them more than their medical skill. They brought books, and a way of living, and a set of convictions that the Pascal children had never encountered in quite this form. Those were strange. Still months inside the house, a father confined to a bed or a chair, his usual restless energy blocked for the first time in his children's memory. Long afternoons with little to do but wait for a hip to knit. Into that stillness came 2 visitors who filled the hours not with idle talk but with reading aloud, and with a kind of conversation the household had not often practised, more inward than the wordplay Blaise had absorbed at Merssenne's table. The Deschamps brothers were laymen, not priests, ordinary men of the region who happened to carry an extraordinary seriousness about the state of a soul, for a household that had always measured a good evening by the sharpness of its wit. This was something new. Wit was not required in that sick-room. Attention was. The brothers were followers of a religious movement that history calls Jansenism, and since it will shape everything that follows, let us take it in one breath. Plainly, it took its name from Cornelius Jansen, a Flemish bishop whose massive book on St. Augustine appeared in 1640, shortly after his death. Stripped to its core, the teaching was this: human beings cannot earn their way to God through good behaviour, clever reasoning, or religious routine. Whatever saving happens by grace, given freely, not purchased by effort, and therefore religion is not a social costume or a Sunday habit. It is a total, interior transformation, or it is nothing. The movement's home was a convent near Paris called Port Royal, and its thinkers were among the sharpest minds in France. Its great rival, increasingly, was the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits, masters of education and diplomacy, who aimed, by their own account, at a more accommodating piety that could meet ordinary sinners where they lived, rather than demand of them what only a few could sustain. To the Jansenists, that same accommodation looked like the disease itself. Religion made comfortable until it made no demands at all. Keep that quarrel in mind, and keep in mind that it has 2 honest sides to it. In a few years, Pascal will walk into the middle of it with a pen, and France will never forget what happened. But in 1646, all of that was still ahead. What happened first was quieter. Blaise, then 22, began reading the books the Deschamps brothers left, and something in them found him. Gilberte's memoir describes this period as her brother's first conversion, and describes him becoming, within the year, the most ardent member of the household, pressing the new seriousness on his father and sisters. The entire family turned toward this austere faith together. And the one it seized most deeply was not Blaise. It was Jacqueline, the Poot, who began to feel, with growing certainty, that her life belonged behind the walls of Port Royal. Notice the strangeness of the timing, because it corrects one of the most common misunderstandings about Pascal. The years of his first religious awakening, 1646 to 1648, are the very years of the vacuum experiments, the public trials, the letters against Father Noel, the mountain. The convert and the experimenter were the same man in the same months. Whatever was happening in his soul, it did not slow his science by a single day. The popular picture of Pascal abandoning reason for faith simply does not fit the calendar. What did slow him was his body. Around 1647, in his mid-20s, Pascal's health collapsed in a way that frightened everyone around him. Gilberte, our main witness, describes a man who for a period could swallow nothing but warm liquids, and only drop by drop, whose legs were afflicted by a partial paralysis, so that he walked only with difficulty, and who was tormented by crushing headaches. The doctors of Paris examined him with the best knowledge of their age, which is to say, they were nearly helpless. Modern writers have tried, retrospectively, to name the illness, and the suggestions range widely, but no diagnosis can be established across 3.5 centuries, and we will not invent one. What the records do establish is the pattern. From this point until his death, he was almost never entirely well, and often in real pain. The medical advice he received has an irony that the rest of his life would spend unfolding. The physicians concluded that his troubles came from an overworked brain, and they prescribed the one medicine a man like Pascal could hardly bear. Stop thinking, rest, amuse yourself, seek company, distraction, the pleasures of ordinary social life. It was during this enforced convalescence in Paris, in the autumn of 1647, that Descartes paid his visits, and along with their tense discussion of the vacuum, the older man offered gentler counsel, recommending rest in bed and simple broths. So picture Pascal at 25, and hold that image, because the tensions in it are the engine of everything to come. A young man who has just measured the sky, ordered by his doctors to be frivolous. A new convert to the most demanding faith in France, instructed to seek amusement, a body failing, a mind accelerating, a sister drifting toward a convent, a father aging in the king's service. In 1648, the family was reunited, and soon Etienne's long labour for the crown drew toward its close. They left Rouen behind and settled again in Paris, the father's work nearly done, the son's fame quietly growing, the daughter's decision quietly hardening. And then, in the autumn of 1651, the event arrived that no Pascal could negotiate with, the one that would break the household into its separate futures and push Blaise, for the only sustained season of his life, out of the study and into the glittering, gambling, candlelit world. His father was dying. Etienne Pascal died in Paris in September of 1651. He was 63 years old, and he had spent the last 2 decades of his life on a single project: the minds of his 3 children. By any measure a father could care about, the project had succeeded. His eldest daughter was raising a family with grace and intelligence. His youngest was one of the most gifted young women in France. His son was famous across Europe before the age of 30. What Blaise felt at the loss survives, because he wrote it down. In October, he sent a long letter of consolation to Gilberte and her husband, and it is one of the earliest windows we have into his private religious mind. The letter does not read like ordinary grief. It is a careful, almost severe meditation, arguing that a Christian should not sorrow like those without hope, that the death of the body is not the end of the person. Readers across the centuries have noticed the strain in it. A man gripping his own faith tightly. As if grief were a current, he refused to be swept away by whatever comfort the letter gave its recipients. One senses it was written at least half to convince its author. The father's death did not just take a person, it took the keystone out of the family, and within months the arch came apart. Jacqueline had been waiting. Her wish to enter the convent of Port Royal had been alive for years, and her father, unwilling to lose her, had asked her to wait while he lived. She had obeyed. Now nothing stood in her way except her brother, and her brother stood firmly. In January of 1652, Jacqueline left the house quietly, almost like an escape, and entered Port Royal as a novice. Blaise was opposed, and the dispute soon found the shape family wounds so often find: money. Jacqueline wished to bring her share of the inheritance to the convent as a dowry. Blaise, joined for a time by Gilberte, resisted handing a fortune over the wall. We should be careful and fair here, because it is easy to cast the brother as a villain. The surviving accounts, including the convent's own records, suggest his motives were tangled: some grief, some finance, and some plain human loneliness. His father was gone. His sister, his closest companion since childhood, was choosing a life that would place her forever behind a grille. In the end, an arrangement was reached, and in June of 1653, Jacqueline took her final vows as Sister Saint Euphemie. By the accounts of the period, the reconciliation between brother and sister that followed was genuine and warm. It would matter enormously later, and now Blaise Pascal was, for the first time in his life, alone, 29 years old, financially independent, famous, motherless, fatherless, and sisterless in any daily sense. The doctors were still prescribing distraction, and Paris, in the 1650s, was the most distracting city on earth. The person who opened its doors was a young nobleman, the Duke of Roannes, governor of Poitou, who had befriended Pascal and drawn him into his circle. Through the Duke, Pascal entered a world his childhood had never shown him. Step into it with him for a moment, because this is the chapter of his life most like an evening you might recognize. A tall house in the fashionable quarters of Paris. Late on a winter night, candles doubled in the mirrors, so that the rooms seem lit twice. The smell of wax and powder and wine. In one room, conversation played as a competitive sport, reputations rising and falling on the turn of a phrase, and a hostess keeping score without ever seeming to. In another, the gaming tables, the dry rattle of dice in a leather cup, the soft slap of cards, little towers of gold moving from one side of green cloth to the other, while the players' faces work very hard at showing nothing. Fortunes genuinely changed hands at those tables. So, more quietly, did ideas. Pascal travelled with the Duke's party to Poitou. He kept, for a time, a carriage and horses, Gilberte's memoir, written by a pious sister looking back, calls this the period of her brother's life he later judged most wasted, the worldly years. But listen closely to what the record actually shows, because it is more interesting than a simple fall from grace. There is no evidence that Pascal gambled away fortunes or lived scandalously. What he did was watch. Two men he met there deserve names, because both left fingerprints on history. One was Damien Mitten, a wealthy gentleman of leisure, a connoisseur of the polished, agreeable self that society life demanded. Pascal studied him the way he had once studied Mercury. Years later, in his private notes, he would address Mitten by name, accusing that whole way of life of covering up the human condition rather than facing it. The other man was Antoine Gombault, who styled himself the Chevalier de Marais, a writer on manners, an authority on the art of being an accomplished gentleman, and a serious gambler. Whatever else the salons were, for Pascal they were a laboratory. He, who had grown up proving theorems, now watched human beings perform themselves in drawing rooms. He saw how boredom drove them to the tables, how amusement was less a pleasure than an escape, how the noise of company kept something at bay that returned the moment the room emptied. He filed it all away. Years later, those observations would surface in his notes on diversion. Some of the most piercing pages ever written about why human beings cannot sit quietly in a room. If you have ever reached for your phone without deciding to, he was writing about you 3.5 centuries in advance. One more thread from these years should be handled with care. Some early sources associate Pascal with thoughts of marriage in this period, and a short essay on the passions of love was once widely attributed to him. Modern scholars doubt the attribution, and the plain truth is that we do not know the state of his heart. What we know is the direction of his mind, because in the winter of 1653 and into 1654, at the gaming tables of his new friends, the Chevalier de Marais put to him a question about dice and money. It was a gambler's complaint, nothing more. It had been asked, in one form or another, for 200 years, and never answered. Pascal picked it up, turned it over, and saw underneath it something no one had ever seen. A mathematics of the future itself. The problem the Chevalier de Marais brought to Pascal sounds, at first hearing, almost trivial. It is called the problem of points, and here it is, exactly as the gamblers of Europe had struggled with it. Two players stake equal money on a series of fair games. Sigh. First to win 6 rounds, takes the whole pot, but the play is interrupted. The candles burn down. The host calls for supper. The police arrive. It does not matter. One player leads 4 rounds to 3. The game will never be finished. How should the pot be divided? Everyone agreed the leader deserved more. No one could say how much more. Split it by rounds 1, 4/7, and 3/7. That feels reasonable, until you notice it ignores how close each player stands to victory. Give it all to the leader. Plainly unjust, because the trailing player might still have won. For 2 centuries, mathematicians had proposed answers, and the answers disagreed, because everyone was staring at the same wrong thing. They were staring at the past, at the rounds already played. Pascal's insight, the hinge on which this entire chapter of human thought turns, was to face the other direction. The past does not matter. The money should be divided according to what was likely to happen next. Count the possible futures. Weigh each one. Divide the pot in proportion to each player's share of the futures. It sounds obvious, once said. Nearly everything permanent does. But consider what is hiding inside that move. For all of recorded history, the future had belonged to the gods, to fate, to fortune's wheel. Chance was, by definition, the thing that could not be reasoned about. Pascal was proposing that uncertainty itself could be measured, that you could put a number on a thing that has not happened yet. To test and sharpen his reasoning, Pascal did what the scientific world of his century did. He wrote a letter, it went south, to Toulouse, to a magistrate named Pierre de Fermat, a man who did mathematics in the margins of his law books for pleasure, and whom history ranks among the greatest mathematicians France has ever produced. Through the summer and autumn of 1654, the 2 men exchanged a series of letters, several of which survive, and that correspondence is now recognized by historians of science as the founding exchange of mathematical probability. What makes the letters delightful, even today, is that the 2 geniuses solved the problem differently and arrived at the same answers. Fermat counted futures directly, listing the possible remaining outcomes, like a man dealing every possible hand. Pascal found a swifter path, reasoning backward step by step through the value of each position, a method that looks, to modern eyes, strikingly like the expected value calculations that actuaries and analysts use today. When their results matched, Pascal wrote to Fermat, in a letter from that exchange, that he saw the truth was the same in Toulouse as in Paris. That same year, Pascal composed a treatise on a triangle of numbers, a simple pyramid in which each entry is the sum of the 2 above it. The pattern itself was ancient. Mathematicians in China, Persia, and India had known it centuries earlier, and the record should say so plainly. But Pascal explored it so deeply, and tied it so firmly to the counting of combinations and the division of stakes, that the Western world has called it Pascal's triangle ever since. In those same pages he gave one of the earliest clear uses of reasoning by mathematical induction, proving a claim for the first case, then proving that each case hands its truth to the next, like a line of falling dominoes stretching to infinity. The gambler's pot, in the end, was the smallest thing at stake in that exchange of letters. The new mathematics of chance did not stay at the gaming table. Within a generation, thinkers across Europe were extending it. In London, a shopkeeper named John Graunt was already counting deaths in the plague records and noticing patterns. And in the decades that followed, minds like Huygens and the Bernoullis carried the new reasoning into commerce, law, and science. Out of that gathering stream came life tables, and insurance, priced by reason instead of guesswork, and eventually the modern science of statistics. The letters between Paris and Toulouse were not the only source of that river, and it would flatter even Pascal to claim so. But they remain one of the places that river can be traced back to, and historians of science routinely rank that correspondence among the most consequential exchanges of letters ever written. When you hear that a trial proved a medicine works, or that tomorrow carries a 70% chance of rain, you are hearing the distant descendants of the problem of points. There is one more thing the new tool could do, and Pascal seems to have sensed it almost immediately. If you can weigh futures, you can weigh decisions, not just dice, but choices, any choice made in the fog of not knowing. What should a reasonable person do when the outcome is uncertain, but the stakes are real? Multiply what you might gain by how likely you are to gain it. Compare. Decide. Within a few years, he would aim that reasoning at the largest uncertainty a human being ever faces, and produce the most famous wager in the history of thought. But that belongs to a later hour of this story, because here the record shows us something strange. 1654 was the summit of his scientific life. The letters with Fermat, the treatise on the triangle, his name honoured across the learned world, and in a document from that very year addressed to a scientific society in Paris, he announced with visible pride a whole list of works in preparation. A man, by every outward sign, at the peak of his powers and full of plans, and yet, according to Jacqueline's letters from that autumn, the man who visited her at the convent was not triumphant. He confessed to her that in the midst of his occupations, and they were great, he felt an emptiness he could not reason away. The world had given him everything it gives its favourites, and some essential hunger had not been touched. The nights were drawing in. November came, cold and dark over Paris, and on the 23rd day of that month, sometime after 10 in the evening, something happened to Blaise Pascal, alone in his room, that he never described to a single living person. We only know of it because of a servant, a quoit, and a piece of parchment. You remember the parchment? Monday, November 23rd, 1654. Paris in early winter. The light gone from the sky by mid-afternoon. The river running cold. Candles already lit in every window that could afford them. Sometime that night, between roughly 10:30 and midnight, something happened to Blaise Pascal in his rooms that overwhelmed him so completely he reached for paper while it was still happening, or immediately after, and tried to set it down, not in sentences, in fragments, single words, broken phrases, lines that stumble and double back, from a man whose prose was ordinarily as controlled as his geometry. We know this because the paper survives. This is the parchment from the beginning of our story. The document a servant found sewn into his coat after his death. 8 years later, Pascal wrote a first draft that night, and at some point copied it carefully onto parchment, and the worn condition of both sheets, along with the reopened seams of the coat, suggests he carried the document with him and moved it between garments for the rest of his life. He never mentioned it to anyone, not to Gilberte, not, as far as any record shows, even to Jacqueline. It came to light only because a servant's fingers noticed a stiffness in the lining of a dead man's coat. The document is known as the Memorial, and the original paper version is preserved today in the National Library of France. You can look at images of it. The handwriting is hurried and uneven. At the top he recorded the date with strange precision, the year, the day, the feast of the church calendar, and then the hours. From about 10:30 in the evening until about midnight, and then, alone on its line, one word, fire. What follows resists summary, and we will not pretend to paraphrase. An experience its own author could barely put into language. He named the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and set that name deliberately against the God of the philosophers and the learned. He wrote certainty twice. He wrote feeling, and joy, and peace. He wrote joy again, 3 times over, then tears of joy. He wrote of having fled, of having been separated, and of total submission. The fragments run down the page the way a man's hands might run if he were trying to hold water in them. That is what the document says. What actually happened in that room? No one can tell you. Pascal never explained it. He left no account beyond the fragments themselves. Believers have read them as the record of a direct encounter with God. Skeptics have proposed everything from a psychological crisis to a neurological event. The position this story takes is the modest one. Something happened to this man, something he experienced as the most real event of his life, real enough that he kept the record of it hidden and close for 8 years and told no one. The parchment is a fact. The fire is his testimony. You may have heard a more dramatic version of this story, and here the record needs to speak plainly. A well-known account says that shortly before that November night, Pascal was nearly killed in a carriage accident at the bridge of Neuilly, his horses plunging over the edge, the carriage saved at the last moment, and that the terror of that brush with death triggered the vision. It is a gripping tale, and it still appears in books, but the story surfaces only in accounts written long after Pascal's death. Nothing from his lifetime mentions it. Gilberte, who recorded her brother's life in close detail, never mentions it. The accident may have happened. The evidence that it did is simply too thin and too late. And the carriage of Neuilly is best understood as a legend that grew up around a truth needing no decoration. Notice what the legend does. It supplies a cause we can understand. A man frightened into faith by nearly dying. The documented reality is stranger. A celebrated scientist, at the height of his powers, in good company and rising fame, who had told his sister that autumn that he felt hollow, and who then, on an ordinary Monday night, with no accident, no illness, no warning the sources can find, wrote the word fire. What changed afterward was not his mind, but his direction. He did not renounce reason. He did not burn his mathematics. The popular image of Pascal abandoning science that night does not survive contact with the calendar. And before this long night of ours is over, we will meet him doing world-class mathematics again. What he renounced, gradually, over the following months, was the life the world had built for him. The salons saw less of him. The carriage and horses eventually went. He began visiting Port Royal, the convent where Jacqueline had taken her vows, and in January of 1655 he withdrew for a retreat among the community of scholars and solitaries who lived near it. There is a detail from Jacqueline's letters of this period worth carrying with you. The sister who had once needed her brother's permission to give her life to God, now became, in her own words, the one who guided him. The roles of their childhood quietly reversed. The famous brother came to the grille of the convent and listened. At Port Royal, Pascal found what the salons had never offered him, a community that took the largest questions with total seriousness, and he arrived at the worst possible moment, or the best, depending on how you measure such things. Because Port Royal was under siege, the most powerful religious order in Europe was moving against it. Its leading theologian was on trial in Paris, and the whole movement stood one vote away from condemnation. They had arguments, they had learning. What they did not have was a voice the public would actually listen to. And then, in January of 1656, a pamphlet appeared in the bookstalls of Paris, unsigned, playful, and precise, written as a letter from a puzzled gentleman to a friend in the provinces. Nobody knew who wrote it. Within weeks, all of France was asking. To understand the war Pascal walked into, you need only two facts, and we will keep them short. First, the fight was officially about theology. 5 propositions, said to be drawn from Janssen's book, had been condemned in Rome in 1653. The Jansenists replied that those propositions, as worded, were not actually in the book. It sounds like a technicality. In that century, careers, convents, and liberty hung on it. Second, and this is what made it matter to all of France, the deeper fight was about moral seriousness. The Jesuits ran the schools of the elite and heard the confessions of kings, and their moral theologians had developed, over decades, a body of case-by-case reasoning called casuistry, meant to fit the demands of religion to the situations of real life. Handled carefully, it was pastoral wisdom for imperfect people. Handled loosely, it became a machine for manufacturing permission, and some of its printed conclusions were loose enough to startle even worldly readers. The Jansenists of Port Royal stood against all of it, and by early 1656 their leading intellectual, Antoine Arnauld, was on trial before the Faculty of Theology in Paris. About to be censured, Arnauld drafted defences in his own learned style, and by the account preserved in the Port Royal Circle, he saw that his pages would persuade no one outside a lecture hall. He turned to the newest and least theological member of the community, the scientist, and asked, in effect, whether he could do better. Pascal, who had never written theology in his life, said he would try. What came out of that try changed French literature. On January 23rd, 1656, the first letter appeared, printed secretly, sold quietly, passed hand to hand. It presented itself as a letter from a curious Parisian to a friend in the country, an ordinary educated man trying to understand what the learned doctors were fighting about. That framing was the masterstroke. Instead of defending Jansenism from inside, the letter walked the reader through the controversy from outside, visiting one expert after another, asking innocent questions, and letting the expert's own answers reveal the emptiness of the case against Arnauld. The tone was light. The learning was invisible. Bari, which had ignored 100 solemn treatises, devoured it and demanded more. More came, 18 letters in all. appearing over about 14 months, through 1656, into the spring of 1657. Everyone was printed in defiance of official censorship and under real risk of prosecution. For the author, if he could be found, and for anyone caught distributing his work, somewhere in that city, in a cellar or a back room past midnight, shutters closed tight, one of those forbidden pamphlets may have been borne something like this: a single lamp, a compositor's fingers moving over the type by feel, setting words for an author he could not name under questioning, because he did not know it. The soft, muffled thump of the press, muffled as much as a press can be muffled, sheets hung to dry in the dark like laundry on a line, before dawn, bundles moving out under cloaks and in market baskets, scattering to booksellers who would later swear, and mean it, that they had simply found the pages on their doorstep. The police raided printers and questioned booksellers across the city, and, according to accounts from the period, they never laid hands on the writer. The most wanted pen in France belonged to a frail mathematician living quietly near a convent, and no one thought to look there. Around the fourth letter, the campaign changed targets, and this is when it became immortal. Defending Arnauld was a rescue. What Pascal did next was an offensive. He turned from the trial to the Jesuit moral casebooks themselves, and he used a weapon theology had rarely seen used at this level. He quoted them, accurately, by page and author, in plain French, before an audience of ordinary readers who had never been allowed into that library. The permissions and workarounds and elegant escapes were lifted out of Latin folios and set down in daylight, in the mouths of genial fictional priests who explain their methods with unfailing, catastrophic cheerfulness. The reader laughs. Then the reader realizes exactly what is being permitted, and the laughter cools into something else. In the 11th letter, Pascal paused to defend the method itself, arguing that ridicule aimed at genuine absurdity is not mockery of sacred things, but a form of respect for them. And in the 16th letter he dropped a line that writers have repeated for 4 centuries, apologizing that the letter ran longer than usual because he had not had time to make it shorter. Every writer listening tonight just nodded in the dark. Was Pascal fair to the Jesuits? Not entirely. Scholars who have checked his quotations find them accurate far more often than his enemies claimed, but selected for maximum damage. The loosest opinions of the loosest authors presented as though they spoke for a whole order that contained, then, as always, many men of real seriousness. It was polemic, brilliant polemic, and polemic simplifies. And did the letters win, in the narrow sense? No. Arnauld was censured anyway. The letters themselves were condemned, and by order of the Royal Council, publicly burned. Within a few years the Sisters of Port Royal would face pressures that broke hearts, and we are coming to that. But some victories refused to arrive on schedule. The letters permanently changed how France viewed lax casuistry, and reforms followed in the decades after. They also changed French writing itself. Pascal showed that the deepest matters could be discussed in short, clear, musical French that a merchant could follow and a duchess could quote, and he helped establish a model of modern French prose, compressed, conversational, and precise. Voltaire, who had scant patience for Pascal's religion, would nonetheless single the letters out, generations later, as among the finest prose his country had yet produced, admiration arriving from a direction nobody would have predicted. He had spent his teens proving theorems, his 20s weighing the sky, his early 30s pricing the future. Now, with a borrowed voice and a hunted press, he had helped remake French prose as a weapon in someone else's war. And while the letters were still appearing, in the spring of 1656, something happened inside the walls of Port Royal to a child he loved that Pascal took as a direct answer from heaven. Whatever we make of it today, it changed the last act of his life, because it convinced him to stop writing letters for other people's battles, and to begin, at last, the book that would carry his own name into every century that followed. He would never finish it, and its unfinished state is precisely why it will never die. The event that changed the last act of Pascal's life happened not to him, but to a child, on March 24th, 1656. While the letters were still appearing, and the presses were still being hunted, a 10-year-old boarding student at Port Royal was touched, during a ceremony, by a relic the convent had received, said to be a thorn from the crown of Christ. The girl had suffered for 3 years from a severe infection near her eye, swollen and ulcerated, which the surgeons of Paris had been unable to cure. Within days, the accounts report, the infection was gone. Physicians examined her before and after. Church authorities investigated and formally declared the cure miraculous. And for a season, the miracle made the persecuted convent politically untouchable. The girl's name was Gilberte Périer. She was Gilberte's daughter, Pascal's own niece, and his goddaughter. What should we make of it? From nearly 4 centuries away, the cure was documented more thoroughly than many healing claims of that era, with medical testimony gathered on both sides of the event. But that testimony was produced inside a fierce religious conflict, by people with everything at stake, and it cannot establish a medical cause at this distance. Some modern writers suggest a misdiagnosis, or a condition that simply resolved. Believers then and now have seen heaven's signature. The record allows both readings, and we leave it in your hands. But we are not telling the story of what happened to Marguerite's eye. We are telling the story of what Pascal believed happened. And about that, there is no doubt at all. He took the cure as a direct answer, a public seal on everything the fire of 1654 had told him in private. From that time he adopted a personal emblem, an eye surrounded by a crown of thorns, and somewhere in the months that followed, a project began to form in his mind. The largest he had ever attempted, not a letter, not a pamphlet, a full defence of the Christian faith, addressed not to theologians, but to the brilliant, restless, unbelieving men he had known in the salons. A book for Mitten, a book for the gamblers. Around 1658, according to the testimony of the Port Royal Circle, he presented the plan of the work to his friends in a talk that reportedly ran between 2 and 3 hours. Those who heard it never forgot it. And then he began to write, in the only way his broken health allowed, on large sheets, in bursts, fragment by fragment, a paragraph here, a single sentence there. Sheets later cut apart and threaded into bundles with string. He managed to sort roughly half the bundles under headings before his strength failed. The rest remained loose. He never finished. What survives is between 800 and 1,000 fragments, published after his death under the modest title Pensées, Thoughts. And here is the strange mercy of history. The ruin became the monument. A finished treatise would have argued with its century and faded with it. The fragments read instead like a mind caught in the act of thinking, sometimes mid-sentence. And readers in every generation since have felt they were overhearing rather than being lectured. The cathedral was never completed, and that is why the sky shows through it. What is actually in those fragments? 3 rooms of the cathedral, briefly, and in our own words rather than his. Since the original French deserves to be read whole and not chopped into borrowed English, the first room is man himself. Pascal's central move is to hold 2 truths at once and refuse to let go of either. In the most repeated fragment of the whole collection, he reaches for the plainest object he can find, a reed growing at the edge of a riverbank, and asks the reader to see themselves in it. A gust of wind bends it. A single drop of water is enough to end it. Human beings, he argues, are exactly this, exposed. This fragile, standing in front of a universe that could erase us without ever noticing the loss. But the reed thinks, and that one fact changes the entire comparison. Crush a man under the weight of the whole universe, and he would still hold something the universe itself does not have. An understanding of what has just happened to him. The falling stars would know nothing. He would know everything. For Pascal, that capacity, the ability to understand our own smallness, is the whole location of human dignity. Not strength, not permanence, understanding, held onto even while being crushed. The second room is the universe. In a long passage on what he calls the disproportion of man, Pascal performs a camera move that cinema would not learn for 3 more centuries. He pulls back, past the sun, past the stars, until the earth is a single point and the imagination gives out trying to hold the distances. Then he pushes back into a mitte, into the might's own limbs, into worlds folded inside worlds, without visible end. A human being, he concludes, hangs suspended between 2 infinities, too small to grasp the first, too large to vanish into the second. He describes trying to hold that whole picture in his mind at once, and admits, in one of the most quoted lines he ever wrote, that the silence of those endless distances left him unsettled rather than reassured. Whether that unease was a genuine confession or a mood he was trying on for the unbeliever he was imagining, scholars still argue about it. Anyone who has ever looked up on a truly dark, star-crowded night has stood exactly where he was standing. And the third room is the famous one, the wager. Here the gambler's mathematics of 1654 returns, aimed at the largest uncertainty of all. Pascal addresses the person who says the existence of God can be neither proved nor disproved, and answers, in effect, then treat it as a decision made under uncertainty, because you are already in the game, whether you like it or not. Weigh the outcomes, stake on faith and be wrong, and the loss is finite. Stake against and be wrong, and the loss is infinite. Philosophers have admired the argument and attacked it in equal measure ever since. Critics ask which God the better is supposed to choose, and whether belief can be summoned on command the way a coin call can, and Pascal, to his credit, anticipated part of that objection. Answering that conviction may follow the practice of faith rather than arrive before it. We are not here tonight to place the bet for you. We report it as what it is historically. One of the earliest and most famous applications of expected value reasoning to a human existential choice. The gambling table's mathematics turn toward the largest table of all. Let that argument settle for a moment before we move on. Whatever you make of it, notice only this. A man who could barely walk across a room on many days had just tried to reason his way through the largest question a human being can ask. What comes next is smaller, almost funny, and it belongs here because it is entirely true, and because it rescues Pascal from turning, in your mind, into someone too solemn to like. In 1658, according to the account preserved by his family, he was kept awake one night by a ferocious toothache, and to distract himself from the pain, he began turning over an unsolved problem of geometry, the mathematics of the cycloid, the elegant curve traced by a point on a rolling wheel. By morning, the pain was forgotten and the problem was broken open. He went on to issue an international challenge on the cycloid under an assumed name, judged the entries himself, and published solutions that historians of mathematics still rank among his finest work that helped prepare the ground for the calculus soon to arrive from Newton and Leibniz. The man writing fragments about the vanity of human science was still, on a bad night, with a toothache, one of the sharpest mathematicians in Europe. Human beings are not tidy. He would have been the first to tell you so. The fragments piled up, the bundles multiplied. The plan of the great book stood clear in his mind. And then history began taking things away. A signature was demanded. A sister's conscience broke, and the gentlest fierce person in this story was about to leave it. In 1661, the storm that had circled Port Royal for a decade finally struck the people inside it. The Crown and the Church authorities, determined to end Jansenism, required members of the French clergy, including nuns, to sign a formulary, a document condemning the 5 propositions and affirming that they were in Jansen's book. For the Sisters of Port Royal, this was not paperwork. They were being asked to sign, as fact, something they had no way of knowing and did not believe, and they understood that refusal could mean the destruction of their community. The pressure applied to a few dozen praying women by the full weight of a kingdom remains one of the sadder small episodes of that century. Jacqueline Pascal, Sister Sainte Euphémie, saw the matter with the clarity that had always run in her family. Letters of hers from that year survive, arguing that, since the bishops already knew the truth, it fell to the humble to show them courage, and asking what it profited anyone to guard the treasure of faith, if the guarding cost a person the truth of her own word. In the end, under obedience and after real agony of conscience, she signed. With qualifications her community attached to the page, and by every account from those close to her, the act of signing broke something in her that never mended. Her health failed through the summer. She died at Port Royal on October 4th, 1661. The same day she turned 36. A coincidence of the calendar her grieving family could not help but read as something more than coincidence. She had been the poet of the family, the child who charmed a cardinal and saved her father, the woman who defied her brother and then converted him, the strongest will in a family of strong wills. Pascal's recorded response to her death, preserved by the family, was that God would grant them the grace to die as well. If that sounds cold to modern ears, hear it in his grammar, in his understanding, my nest his little sister had just won. Those near him reported that his grief ran deeper than his words allowed, and within months his own final decline began, as if some cord between them had carried more weight than anyone had realized. Pascal's own position on the formulary had been fiercer than almost anyone's at Port Royal. He argued against signing at all, and when the leaders of the movement, men he revered, chose accommodation in order to survive, the disagreement wounded him badly. According to an account from the circle, at one gathering where the matter was settled against his view, the argument overwhelmed him and he collapsed, and had to be carried from the room. After that, he largely withdrew from the controversy. He had already given the movement his pen, his fame, and now his sister. There was little left to give. What he did next is, depending on how you look at it, either a footnote or one of the most quietly beautiful endings in the history of invention. Through his friend the Duke of Roannes, Pascal had become involved in a scheme of a completely new kind. The idea was this: in the Paris of that era, a private coach was a luxury of the rich, and everyone else walked through mud, weather, and distance. But suppose coaches ran along fixed routes, on a fixed schedule, stopping at known points, and suppose a passenger could board for a small flat fare of 5 sols, not a hired cab reserved for a single wealthy client, but a shared vehicle, running whether or not any particular person happened to appear at the stop. The company was formed, the royal privilege was obtained, and on March 18th, 1662, the first line opened, running across Paris by way of the Luxembourg. Picture the reaction of a city that had never seen such a thing. Crowds gathered along the route that first week, according to accounts of the launch, simply to watch a coach that belonged to no single passenger stop, take on strangers who had never met, and carry them all together toward wherever they were going. The novelty succeeded well enough that more lines soon followed. Historians of the city regard the service as a genuine anticipation of public transit, carrying inside it the defining features of everything that came later: fixed routes, regular departures, shared vehicles, a standard fare. It did not last. Fare increases, and rules that gradually excluded the ordinary passengers it had first attracted wore the service down within a few decades, and the idea would sleep in Paris until the omnibus returned in the 1820s. But the pattern had been cut, and it had been cut partly by a dying geometer, by the testimony of his family. Letters from that spring record, Pascal directing that money from the enterprise, including an advance on his own share, be sent to the poor of provinces then suffering a hard winter. Set the two halves of that year side by side, because together they are a portrait of the whole man. In 16, 61, and 62, the author of the Pensées, waiting on eternity, fragments of the great book still accumulating in their bundles, spent working hours on fare structures, route schedules, and the logistics of moving ordinary people through a city The man of the two infinities was also the man of the five-soul coach. He saw no contradiction. And by now, deep in this night, perhaps you can see why charity, for him, had stopped being a sentiment and had become an engineering problem. One more thing to be solved with the same patient attention he had once given to gears and mercury. His severity toward himself in these final years makes for harder listening, and we will report it briefly, as his sister did. Gilberte's memoir records that he gave away fine furnishings, kept his rooms bare, and refused the small comforts his illness quietly begged for. She writes that after his death the family found, among his things, an iron belt with points turned inward, which he had worn against his skin when he felt his own vanity stirring. The practice belonged to a spirituality of his age far more than of ours, and we set it down without praise and without mockery, as evidence how, literally, he had come to wage war on his own pride. In June of 1662, a poor family that Pascal had taken into his house fell ill, and the illness was smallpox. Rather than turn them out, he left. He moved the short distance to Gilberte's house in Paris, telling those around him, by the family's account, that since the sick could not be moved, the healthy one would go. He would never live anywhere else. The headaches returned. Then, worse than headaches, the doctors came, disagreed, and reassured, and the man who had measured the sky, priced the future, and hidden fire in his coat began, calmly and with open eyes, to do the last thing on his list. He began to The room in Gilberte's house was small, and through the summer of 1662 it became the whole world. The illness that took hold of Pascal in those final weeks has never been named with any certainty, and by now you know this story too well to expect an invented diagnosis. The headaches grew violent. He could keep almost nothing down. The physicians who attended him, among the best in Paris, examined him repeatedly and concluded, almost to the end, that there was no mortal danger, that it was the old familiar suffering they had managed for years. Pascal disagreed with them, quietly and completely. By the testimony of his sister, who was in the room, he understood from early in the illness that he was dying, and he was the only one in the house who did. Gilberte's memoir of these weeks is one of the most detailed deathbed accounts of the 17th century, and it remains our main window, so we will use it remembering exactly who wrote it. A grieving and devout sister. What she describes is not a man raging against the dark. It is a man attending to details. He asked repeatedly to be moved to the hospital for incurables, so that he might die among the poor, and was refused only because the doctors said the journey would kill him outright. He asked that a poor sick man be brought into the house instead, to share the care he was receiving, and when that proved impractical, he made the family promise it would be done in some other form. He confessed and received the sacraments of his church, and Gilberte writes that when the priest brought them, he raised himself despite everything, and received them in tears. She records his final words as a prayer, asking that God never abandon him. In the early hours of August 19th, 1662, after convulsions that had lasted through the night, Blaise Pascal died. He was 39 years and 2 months old. He was buried in the church of Saint Etienne du Mont in Paris, where his tomb can be visited today. The funeral register survives. The learned world took note, and letters of the period record the sense, even among those who had fought him, that something rare had gone out of it. And then, in the days after the burial, came the moment this whole night has been circling. A servant, going through the dead man's clothes, felt something stiff sewn into the lining of a coat. The stitches were opened. Inside was a small folded parchment, written over in a careful hand, and inside the parchment a worn sheet of paper carrying the same words in a rougher, more hurried script. The family gathered. They read the date at the top, November 23rd, 1654, 8 years earlier, and below the date, alone on its own line, the single word, fire. The family understood at once what they were holding. The reworked seams told their own quiet story. A document unstitched and sewn back in as coats wore out and were replaced, kept close through the years, and never once mentioned, through the provincial letters and the hunted presses, through the miracle and the fragments, through Jacqueline's death and the 5-sol coaches. He had kept it with him, and had told no one. The most public wit in France had carried his deepest hour in total silence. Next to his skin, we open this story with a servant's fingers finding that parchment, and we asked what a man like Pascal could possibly have needed to hide. Now you know the answer, and it is worth noticing what kind of answer it is. Not a scandal, not a debt, not a formula. What he hid was certainty, the one thing he could not prove. From the one night he could not doubt. The geometer kept his theorems in books for the whole world, and kept the fire in his coat for no one. The bundles of fragments were found as well, the great unfinished book in its hundreds of pieces, and the family and the community of Port Royal began the long, careful work of copying and arranging them. 8 years after his death, in 1670, the first edition of the Pensées was published. It has remained in print, and in argument, ever since. 39 years. It is worth pausing on the number. Here, in the quiet, he spent most of them in real pain, and in that span he touched mathematics, physics, engineering, philosophy, theology, literature, and the streets of a city, and left each one changed. It is natural to wonder what a second half of that life might have held. But there was no second half. There was one short life, fully spent, and a coat with a secret in it. What there was, instead of a second half, was an afterlife, and it is still going on tonight, quietly, in the world you will wake up to tomorrow. Every life in this series leaves monuments, and Pascal's are unusually easy to find, because 2 of them carry his name in lowercase letters. In science, the Pascal is the international unit of pressure. The standard measure for the weight of the air, he proved, was real, used across physics and engineering, and reported in hectopascals by weather services in much of the world. In technology, a programming language named Pascal trained a generation of the people who built the personal computer age. A unit and a language. Very few human beings become part of the working vocabulary of civilization twice over, but his deepest monument carries no name at all, because it is a habit of mind rather than an object. It is the habit of weighing futures. Before the letters of 1654, chance belonged to fate, and the future belonged to fortune. Afterward, slowly, through many hands, uncertainty became something a person could reason about, and out of that long stream came the sciences of risk and statistics that now quietly steady the modern world. Pascal did not build that river by himself, and he would have been the first to credit Fermat and the many who came after. But he stands at one of its clearest springs. Whenever a decision gets made carefully in the dark, weighing what may come against what it may cost, something of the problem of points is present in the room, whether anyone names it or not. And then there are the words. The Pensées have never stopped finding readers, and the readers have never agreed about them, which is exactly what Pascal would have expected. Believers have found in the fragments the most searching defence of faith ever attempted. Unbelievers, from the philosophers of the Enlightenment to the existentialists of the 20th century, have found in the same pages an unmatched account of the human condition, the boredom, the diversion, the two infinities, the reed that thinks. Voltaire spent much of his life arguing against the book, which is its own kind of tribute. Nietzsche, who agreed with almost no one, confessed something close to love for Pascal, and every writer since who has noticed that people reach for their screens because silence has become unbearable is repeating, knowingly or not, an observation made at candlelit gaming tables by a man who understood that the phone and the dice are, underneath, the same invention. So what is the final verdict of this channel? At the end of this long night, it is this. The most modern thing about Blaise Pascal is not the calculator, or the unit, or even the probability. It is his refusal to simplify himself. He is claimed today by scientists and by believers, by rationalists and by mystics, and he belongs entirely to none of them, because he insisted on holding the whole contradiction at once. That reason is glorious, and reason has limits, that the universe is silent, and the silence is not the last word. That man is wretched, and man is great, and the greatness lives precisely in knowing the wretchedness. Almost every thinker before and since has resolved that tension by cutting away one side of it. Pascal carried both. The way he carried the parchment, next to the skin, all the way to the end. He was not a saint, and this story has not tried to sand him into one. He was vain about his gifts, and knew it. Harsh with his body past what any wisdom requires. Unfair in polemic when the fight was on. A man who quarrelled over an inheritance with a sister he adored. He was, in short, a thinking reed, one of ours. That is precisely the point of him. The sky was not weighed, and the future was not tamed by a marble figure. It was done by a sick, grieving, brilliant, contradictory man who rarely knew a day without pain, and never once wasted one. 39 years. 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 39 years, 39 years, 39 years. One coat, and among the words sewn inside it, two that seemed to answer each other across every page he ever wrote afterward: certainty, joy. Our story is over now, and it can be counted on one hand. A boy on a floor, drawing circles he had no names for, a brass box that added so that a father could finally rest, a silver column that weighed the sky, a letter to Toulouse with the future folded inside it, and a piece of parchment carried warm against a heartbeat, keeping the only secret he ever kept. 5 things. One short life. That is the whole ledger, and it balances. Somewhere in Paris tonight, behind museum glass, the little machine is sleeping. If someone turned its dials, it would still add, tooth by tooth, carrying the one, the way it has for nearly 400 years. It does not know it was built out of love. It only knows its rules. That was always the difference between the machine and the man who made it. The machine could count anything except what mattered most. The man knew what mattered, knew it could not be counted at all, and carried the proof of it where no one would ever think to look. So let the numbers rest now. Let the presses fall silent and the courtroom empty. Let the mercury settle in its glass, and the mountain stand patient in the dark above Clermont, holding up nothing tonight but the quiet. You do not have to solve anything before morning. That work is finished, and it was finished long ago, by a man who kept his joy sewn inside his coat and let the rest of the world see only the coat. If this life earned a place in your evenings, Legends Uncovered will be here when you are ready for the next one. Until then, close your eyes and let today, what is finished, set apart from what can simply wait. Sleep now. The gears will remember how to count.